Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most bizarrely morbid medical practices. A time when your stuffy nose could literally be treated with ground-up Egyptian pharaohs. Picture this. You're standing in a bustling 18th-century European marketplace, the air thick with the scent of exotic spices, horse manure, and something else. Something distinctly ancient and unsettling. That mysterious aroma. It's coming from the apothecary's stall, where jars filled with what looks like dark, crumbly earth sit prominently displayed. Except it's not earth at all. It's powdered human remains, marketed as the ultimate cure for everything from headaches to consumption. You probably won't survive the sheer absurdity of what people once considered cutting-edge medicine, but that's exactly why we're here tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to a world where the line between medicine and madness was thinner than parchment, where desperate Europeans looked to ancient Egypt not for archaeological wonder, but for pharmaceutical salvation. The practice of consuming mummy powder, yes, actual ground-up human mummies, wasn't some fringe cult activity relegated to dark corners of society. This was mainstream medicine, recommended by respected physicians, sold in legitimate apothecaries, and consumed by everyone from aristocrats to merchants. The irony is almost too perfect. Civilizations that had spent centuries perfecting the art of preservation suddenly found their carefully preserved dead being ground into powder to treat the sniffles of people who couldn't even pronounce Tutankhamun correctly. The journey of mummies, from sacred burial chambers to European medicine cabinets, began with a series of spectacular misunderstandings that would make even the most gullible internet conspiracy theorist blush. When European traders first encountered the Arabic word mumia, referring to the bituminous substance used in mummification, they somehow convinced themselves that the entire mummy, wrappings, flesh, and all possessed miraculous healing properties. It's like hearing about the healing properties of aloe vera and deciding to eat the entire plant, pot included. Historians still argue whether this confusion was genuine ignorance or willful misinterpretation, driven by profit motives. But the result was the same. A thriving international trade in human remains disguised as medical innovation. The demand for mummy medicine exploded across Europe during the 16th through 18th centuries, coinciding perfectly with an era when medical knowledge was advancing just enough to be dangerous, but not quite enough to be sensible. You're living in a time when bloodletting is still considered a viable treatment for fever, when mercury is prescribed for syphilis, and when the prevailing medical theory suggests that illness is caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. In this context, consuming ancient Egyptian corpses doesn't seem quite as insane, though it's still pretty insane. The practice practice became so normalized that European pharmacopoeias, official medical reference books, included detailed instructions for preparing and administering mummy powder, treating it with the same clinical detachment as modern medical texts discuss antibiotics. What makes this historical moment particularly fascinating is how it reveals the intersection of colonial exploitation, medical desperation, and cultural misunderstanding. European demand for mummy medicine created an entire industry of tomb raiding in Egypt, where local entrepreneurs recognized the lucrative opportunity in their ancestors' remains. The most prized mummies were those of ancient Egyptian nobility, identified by their elaborate wrappings and expensive burial goods, though in practice, any adequately preserved corpse could be ground up and sold to gullible Europeans. The quality control standards were, shall we say, somewhat relaxed, as long as it looked sufficiently ancient and exotic, it could cure your cough. The medical logic behind mummy consumption was based on the principle of sympathetic magic mixed with early pharmaceutical theory. Practitioners believed that because mummies had been preserved for thousands of years, they contained concentrated life force that could be transferred to the living. It's the same reasoning that convinced people that eating a tiger's heart would make them brave, except applied to respiratory ailments and ancient corpses. European physicians theorized that the preservation process had somehow concentrated the body's vital essences, creating a powerful medicinal substance. They were half right about concentration, just wrong about everything else. You push open the heavy wooden door of a London apothecary shop, circa 1750, and step into what can only be described as a museum of medical horrors, masquerading as a legitimate healthcare facility. Morning light filters through grimy windows, illuminating shelves lined with ceramic jars bearing labels that would make a modern pharmacist question their career choices. Mumia aegyptiaca, powdered mummy, and the cheerfully straightforward ancient Egyptian. Grade A behind the counter. The apothecary, a respectable gentleman in a powdered wig, weighs out portions of what was once someone's great-great-great-grandmother with the same casual precision he uses for measuring chamomile tea. Welcome to healthcare before the concept of medical ethics got in the way of entrepreneurial creativity. The normalization of mummy medicine in European apothecaries represents one of history's most successful marketing campaigns for a product that was, fundamentally, seasoned human jerky. These weren't back alley dealers peddling questionable substances to desperate addicts. These were licensed medical professionals operating legitimate businesses under royal charter. The Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London, established in 1617, actually regulated the quality and pricing of mummy powder alongside more conventional medicines like willow bark and mercury. You're witnessing the bureaucratization of cannibalism, complete with quality standards and price controls. The going rate for premium Egyptian mummy was roughly equivalent to 8 shillings per ounce, expensive enough to ensure only the wealthy could afford the finest grade of ancient human remains. What strikes you most about these apothecary shops is the matter-of-fact presentation of mummy medicine alongside herbs, minerals, and other conventional remedies. The powdered mummy sits in decorative jars next to ginger root and dried lavender, as if grinding up pharaohs was just another agricultural product to be harvested and processed. The apothecaries had developed an entire taxonomy for different grades of mummy. Egyptian mummies were considered the premium product. Libyan mummies were acceptable substitutes. And in times of shortage, even European corpses that had been artificially aged could be passed off as genuine ancient medicine. It's like a wine classification system, except instead of vintages and terroirs, you're dealing with decomposition rates and geographic origins of dead people. The preparation methods used by apothecaries would horrify modern health inspectors, but were considered state-of-the-art pharmaceutical practice at the time. Mummies would arrive in European ports, still partially wrapped, often accompanied by certificates of authenticity that were about as reliable as a $3 bill. The apothecary would carefully unwrap the remains, removing any valuable amulets or jewelry want not, before grinding the flesh and bones into a fine powder using mortars and pestles specifically designated for this purpose. Some establishments offered custom blending services, mixing mummy powder with honey, wine, or other substances to mask the taste, which contemporary accounts describe as resembling old fish mixed with tar. Delicious. The customer experience of purchasing mummy medicine reveals the social dynamics of 18th century medical consumerism. Wealthy patients could afford to be particular about their corpse consumption, requesting specific types of mummies or particular preparation methods. The emerging middle class often settled for standard-grade mummy powder, while the poor had to make do with cheaper alternatives that may or may not have contained actual Egyptian remains. Historians still argue whether the demand for authenticity was driven by genuine belief in the superior medicinal properties of Egyptian mummies, or simply by the social status associated with consuming expensive imported corpses. But the market dynamics were unmistakably real. The apothecaries themselves seemed to maintain a curious cognitive dissonance about their product line. Contemporary records show these same shopkeepers who ground up mummies on Tuesday would attend church on Sunday and lecture their children about respecting the dead. Many apothecaries rationalized their trade by arguing that they were giving new purpose to remains that would otherwise decay uselessly in desert tombs, a sort of early recycling program, except with human beings. The mental gymnastics required to sell ground-up people as medicine while maintaining social respectability would impress even modern pharmaceutical marketers. You find yourself standing at the edge of an Egyptian tomb, watching the grotesque theater of mummy harvesting unfold before your eyes like a macabre archaeological expedition run by venture capitalists. The morning desert sun casts long shadows across the sand as teams of local workers, directed by European merchants and their Egyptian partners, systematically strip ancient burial sites of their occupants. This isn't archaeology, it's industrialized grave robbing with international shipping logistics. The workers move with practiced efficiency, extracting mummified remains from sarcophagi with the casual professionalism of factory workers, processing any other export commodity. You're witnessing the birth of what might be history's most ghoulish supply chain, where the end product happens to be people who died 3,000 years ago. The mummy trade created an entire shadow economy in Egypt, complete with specialized roles, territorial disputes, and quality control standards that would make a modern cartel jealous. Professional tomb locators used ancient maps and local knowledge to identify promising burial sites, while extraction teams specialized in the delicate work of removing mummies without damaging the valuable wrappings. Transportation specialists developed methods for shipping human remains across the Mediterranean without excessive deterioration, and quality assessors learned to distinguish between genuinely ancient mummies and recently deceased locals who had been artificially aged through chemical treatments. It's like a vertical integration model, except instead of manufacturing widgets, they're harvesting ancestors. The European end of the supply chain was dominated by merchant trading companies that treated mummy importation as just another exotic commodity, alongside spices, textiles, and precious metals. The Levant Company, which held monopolistic trading rights in the Eastern Mediterranean, included mummy powder in their regular shipments alongside more conventional goods. Maritime insurance policies from the period show that mummy cargoes were classified under sundry medical supplies, with premium rates calculated based on the cargo's tendency to deteriorate during long sea voyages. Ship manifests list Egyptian mummy 50 barrels, with the same bureaucratic detachment as olive oil 30 amphorae. You're looking at the paperwork of history's most bizarre international trade network. The quality control challenges faced by mummy traders would test the ingenuity of any supply chain manager. Authentic Egyptian mummies commanded premium prices, but distinguishing genuine ancient remains from recently manufactured fakes required expertise that few European importers possessed. Unscrupulous suppliers developed increasingly sophisticated counterfeiting methods, including the practice of instant mummification, taking recently deceased individuals and subjecting them to accelerated aging processes using bitumen, spices, and chemical treatments. Some entrepreneurial Egyptians established what were essentially mummy factories, producing made-to-order corpses that could fool casual inspection. The irony is that these fake mummies were probably safer to consume than the genuine articles, though that's setting the bar pretty low. The social dynamics of the mummy trade reveal the complex colonial relationships that enabled this macabre commerce. European demand created economic opportunities for local Egyptian entrepreneurs, but it also led to the systematic desecration of their cultural heritage. Many Egyptian tomb raiders rationalized their activities by arguing that European gold was more useful than ancient burial goods, while European merchants convinced themselves they were preserving Egyptian history by giving mummies new purpose as medicine. Historians still argue whether the mummy trade represents cultural exchange or cultural exploitation, but the Egyptian tombs that were systematically emptied during this period can't argue back. Logistics of transporting human remains across continents in the 18th century created challenges that would stump modern shipping companies. Mummies had to be packaged carefully to prevent further deterioration, but not so carefully that customs officials became suspicious about the cargo. Many shipments were disguised as other goods or mixed with legitimate pharmaceutical supplies to avoid questions from authorities who might object to importing corpses for culinary purposes. The spoilage rate was significant. Maritime records indicate that roughly 30% of mummy cargoes arrived in European ports in condition too deteriorated for sale, leading to the development of specialized preservation techniques for shipping dead people as if they were produce. You settle into the consultation room of Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, one of London's most respected physicians, watching as he examines a patient complaining of persistent winter congestion with the gravitas of a man who has spent decades studying the human body and has reached the scientific conclusion that consuming Egyptian corpses is an excellent treatment for respiratory ailments. The room smells of leather, tobacco, and something faintly medicinal that you're beginning to recognize as the distinctive aroma of processed mummy. Dr. Blackwood's diploma from the Royal College of Physicians hangs prominently on the wall, lending institutional authority to what is about to unfold. A learned medical professional confidently prescribing ground-up farro for a head cold. You're witnessing the intersection of legitimate medical training and spectacularly misguided therapeutic theory. The medical establishment's embrace of mummy medicine wasn't a fringe movement. It was mainstream therapeutic practice, endorsed by the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe. The Royal Society of London, that bastion of scientific advancement, published papers discussing the optimal preparation methods for mummy powder. University medical schools included mummy therapeutics in their curricula, alongside anatomy and surgery. The Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, the official medical reference book, listed detailed instructions for preparing and administering various forms of mummy medicine. You're observing a historical moment when institutional medical authority was used to legitimize what was essentially licensed cannibalism with a prescription pad. Dr. Blackwood's diagnostic process reveals the elaborate theoretical framework that physicians used to justify mummy consumption. After examining your throat, checking your pulse, and inquiring about your humoral constitution, he explains that your cold symptoms indicate an excess of phlegmatic humors that can only be balanced by the concentrated vital essences found in properly preserved ancient Egyptian flesh. The logic is internally consistent within the medical paradigms of the time. If illness results from imbalanced bodily humors, and if mummies contain concentrated life force from their preservation process, then consuming mummy powder should restore humoral equilibrium. It's wrong, but it's systematically wrong, which somehow makes it more troubling than random wrongness. The prescription process followed established medical protocols with bureaucratic precision. Dr. Blackwood writes out a formal prescription on official letterhead: Mumia aegyptiaca, 2 drams, to be mixed with wine and consumed twice daily until symptoms subside. He provides detailed instructions about preparation methods, warns about potential side effects, mostly digestive discomfort, though he diplomatically avoids mentioning that you're eating someone's grandmother, and schedules a follow-up appointment to monitor your progress. The prescription is then taken to a licensed apothecary for fulfillment, creating a paper trail that documents the systematic medicalization of corpse consumption. Modern insurance companies would have a field day with these claims. The physician-patient relationship around mummy medicine reveals fascinating insights into medical authority and patient compliance in pre-modern healthcare. Patients rarely questioned their doctor's recommendations about consuming ancient human remains, partly because medical knowledge was considered too specialized for laypeople to understand, and partly because the alternative treatments available weren't significantly less bizarre. Dr. Blackwood's patients trusted his expertise implicitly, even when that expertise led to prescriptions that modern medicine would classify as both useless and potentially harmful. The placebo effect was undoubtedly strong. If your highly educated, socially respected physician confidently prescribes mummy powder, you're likely to feel better regardless of the actual therapeutic value of ancient Egyptian flesh. The medical literature of the period contains detailed case studies documenting mummy treatment outcomes with the same clinical detachment found in modern medical journals. Physicians recorded dosages, treatment durations, patient responses, and side effects with scientific rigor, creating a substantial body of empirical data about a therapy that was fundamentally absurd. Some doctors specialized in mummy medicine, developing reputations as experts in ancient Egyptian therapeutic substances. Historians still argue whether these physicians genuinely believed in their treatments or were simply capitalizing on a profitable medical trend. But their detailed clinical notes suggest at least some degree of sincere conviction about the therapeutic value of processed pharaohs. You stand mesmerized in the back room of Master Apothecary Edmund Grimsby's establishment, watching him transform what was once a proud Egyptian noble into a fine powder with the methodical precision of a master chef preparing exotic spices. The process unfolds with disturbing casualness, unwrapping ancient linen bandages like opening a particularly morbid present, examining the desiccated flesh for quality indicators, and then systematically grinding the remains using specialized equipment designed specifically for processing human corpses. The mortar and pestle reserved for mummy preparation are larger than those used for conventional herbs, carved from granite to handle the density of preserved bone and cartilage. You're witnessing pharmaceutical manufacturing at its most macabre, complete with with quality control standards and batch processing techniques. Master Grimsby explains his methodology with the pride of a craftsman who has perfected his art through years of experience. Different parts of the mummy require different processing techniques. The softer tissues are ground first using wooden pestles to avoid contamination with metal particles, while bones and teeth require the granite equipment for proper pulverization. The wrappings are processed separately, as they're considered to have absorbed medicinal properties from prolonged contact with the preserved flesh. Some apothecaries offer premium services, processing mummies by anatomical region, brain powder for headaches, heart powder for circulation problems, finger bones for arthritis. It's like a medieval version of organ-specific medicine, except all the organs are several thousand years old and probably not sterile. The quality assessment process would impress modern pharmaceutical inspectors with its attention to detail, even if the actual product being assessed would horrify them. Master Grimsby examines each mummy for indicators of proper preservation, the color and consistency of the flesh, the integrity of the bone structure, the aroma, which should be earthy but not putrid, and the presence of original burial spices. He can distinguish between Egyptian mummies from different dynasties based on preservation techniques and wrapping styles, knowledge that directly impacts the final product's market value. The most prized mummies are those with intact internal organs, as these command premium prices from customers who believe that consuming complete ancient humans provides superior therapeutic benefits. The blending and packaging procedures reveal the apothecary's commitment to customer satisfaction and product differentiation. Standard mummy powder is mixed with common carriers like honey or wine to improve palatability, while premium preparations include exotic spices and rare medicinal herbs to justify higher prices. Some apothecaries offer custom blending services, combining mummy powder with other substances based on individual patient needs or physician specifications. The final product is packaged in decorative containers with elegant labels that emphasize the Egyptian origins and ancient provenance of the contents, marketing mummy powder with the same promotional sophistication used for luxury goods. You're looking at consumer branding applied to processed corpses. The production volume handled by successful apothecaries was substantial enough to require systematic inventory management and supplier relationships. Master Grimsby maintains detailed records of his mummy processing activities, source locations, processing dates, batch yields, and customer preferences. His ledgers show that a single Egyptian mummy can produce between 15 and 20 pounds of finished pharmaceutical powder, depending on the preservation quality and processing efficiency. During peak cold and flu season, his establishment might process several mummies per week to meet customer demand. The seasonal nature of the business required careful inventory planning. You don't want to run out of dead pharaohs during influenza outbreaks. The workshop safety procedures, such as they were, focused more on product quality than worker protection. Master Grimsby wears leather gloves and a cloth mask during processing, not to protect himself from potential health hazards, but to prevent contamination of the valuable mummy powder with skin oils and respiratory moisture. The grinding equipment is cleaned between different mummy batches to avoid cross-contamination between different grades of ancient corpse. Historians still argue whether apothecaries understood the potential health risks associated with processing decomposed human remains, but their safety protocols suggest that product purity was a higher priority than worker well-being, which is probably the most 18th century attitude imaginable. You find yourself seated at an elegant dinner party in a Georgian mansion, watching as Lady Pemberton casually mentions to her guests that she's been taking Egyptian mummy powder for her seasonal allergies, eliciting nods of approval and requests for her apothecaries' contact information rather than the horrified silence such a statement might produce today. The conversation flows from mummy medicine to the latest fashions from Paris, with the seamless social grace of people for whom consuming ancient human remains is simply another lifestyle choice available to those with sufficient means and sophistication. Welcome to high society, where your health regimen can literally include eating dead pharaohs, and nobody thinks this is even slightly unusual. The social stratification of mummy medicine consumption created distinct market segments that would make modern luxury goods marketers weep with envy. Genuine Egyptian mummy commanded prices equivalent to fine wine or imported silk, making it accessible only to the wealthy elite who could afford to treat their ailments with premium ancient corpses. The emerging merchant class typically settled for lower-grade mummy preparations or blended products that diluted the expensive ancient flesh with more affordable ingredients. The working poor, when they could afford mummy medicine at all, had to make do with dubious substitutes that might contain actual mummy powder or might just be colored sawdust with creative labeling. Social status was literally measured by the quality of dead people you could afford to consume. The competitive aspects of fashionable mummy consumption reveal the intersection of healthcare and social performance in 18th century European society. Wealthy patrons would boast about the provenance of their mummy supplies. Having access to powder from a confirmed pharaoh was the ultimate status symbol, while settling for anonymous ancient Egyptians marked you as merely affluent rather than truly elite. Some collectors specialized in mummy medicine from specific time periods or dynasties, developing expertise that allowed them to hold forth at dinner parties about the superior therapeutic properties of Old Kingdom versus New Kingdom corpses. It's like wine collecting, except instead of vintages, you're discussing decomposition rates and burial techniques. The gender dynamics of mummy medicine consumption reflected broader patterns of 18th century medical treatment and social expectations. Women were considered more susceptible to various ailments due to their supposedly delicate constitutions, making them primary consumers of mummy-based remedies for everything from menstrual irregularities to nervous disorders. Upper-class women often maintained detailed correspondence about their mummy medicine experiences sharing recommendations about suppliers, preparation methods, and therapeutic outcomes. With the same enthusiasm, modern people discuss vitamin supplements. Men typically consumed mummy powder for more serious ailments, or as a general tonic to maintain vigor, though they were less likely to discuss their corpse consumption habits in social settings. The cultural performance of mummy medicine consumption required sophisticated social knowledge about proper etiquette and presentation. Serving mummy-based preparations to guests was considered a mark of hospitality and refinement, but the presentation had to strike the right balance between acknowledging the exotic nature of the ingredients and normalizing their consumption as sophisticated medical practice. Hosts would casually mention the Egyptian origins of their remedies, while downplaying the fact that everyone was essentially participating in a cannibalistic tea party. The ability to consume ancient human remains with appropriate social grace became a marker of cosmopolitan sophistication and medical enlightenment. The gift-giving aspects of mummy medicine created unique social obligations and opportunities within elite circles. Premium mummy powder was considered an appropriate and thoughtful gift for friends experiencing health difficulties, demonstrating both concern for their well-being and access to expensive imported remedies. Some wealthy individuals maintained stocks of various mummy preparations to distribute during social visits, much like bringing wine to dinner parties, except instead of wine, you're giving people processed corpses. Historians still argue whether gift recipients genuinely appreciated receiving ancient human remains for their birthdays, but social conventions required gracious acceptance regardless of personal feelings about consuming someone's ancestors. You witness the panic spreading through European medical circles as word arrives that Egyptian mummy supplies are running dangerously low, creating a crisis that combines the urgency of a pharmaceutical shortage with the absurdity of running out of dead people to eat. The year is 1760, and the seemingly inexhaustible supply of ancient Egyptian corpses is proving to be quite exhaustible after all, leading to desperate measures that would make modern supply chain managers question the sanity of their predecessors. Apothecaries frantically send letters to their Egyptian suppliers pleading for any available mummy stock, while wealthy patients hoard their remaining powder like gold. You're watching the collapse of a market built entirely on a finite resource that can't be replenished without a time machine. The mathematical reality of mummy depletion was inevitable, but apparently never considered by the European medical establishment. Egypt, despite its impressive history of mummification, had produced a finite number of preserved corpses over its 3,000-year civilization. When you're systematically grinding up entire cemeteries to treat European head colds, even ancient Egyptian burial practices can't keep pace with 18th-century consumption patterns. Conservative estimates suggest that European demand consumed approximately 1,200 mummies annually at the peak of the trade, meaning that thousands of ancient Egyptians were being converted into pharmaceutical powder every decade. The supply chain was unsustainable from the beginning, but nobody wanted to acknowledge that they were literally eating their way through Egyptian history. The crisis spawned increasingly creative solutions that ranged from ingenious to horrifying. Some suppliers began offering aged European mummy, claiming that recently deceased corpses could be artificially enhanced through chemical treatment to approximate the therapeutic properties of genuine Egyptian remains. Others developed mummy substitute preparations, using various combinations of animal bones, spices, and tar to create products that looked and smelled like genuine mummy powder, but contained no actual human remains, probably the healthiest option available, though nobody knew it at the time. The most enterprising fraudsters established entire manufacturing operations dedicated to producing fake mummies, using criminal corpses, vagrant bodies, and anyone else whose disappearance wouldn't attract official attention. The quality control challenges during the shortage period revealed the disturbing extent to which the mummy medicine market had depended on consumer ignorance. With genuine Egyptian mummies becoming increasingly rare, the market was flooded with substitutes of wildly varying quality and authenticity. Apothecaries, who had built their reputations on providing premium ancient corpses, found themselves having to choose between admitting the shortage or selling questionable products to maintain their customer base. Many chose the latter option, leading to a market filled with products labeled as Egyptian mummy that might contain anything from processed livestock to sawdust mixed with bitumen. The irony is that customers were probably safer consuming the fake products, though their colds remained equally uncured. The economic disruption caused by the mummy shortage rippled through European medical and commercial networks with surprising intensity. Apothecaries, who had specialized in mummy medicine, found their business models collapsing as supply costs skyrocketed and customer confidence eroded. Some establishments that had built their entire operations around processing and selling ancient corpses were forced to diversify into more conventional pharmaceuticals, requiring significant retraining in the preparation of medicines that hadn't been dead for millennia. The shipping industry lost a lucrative cargo category, while customs officials no longer had to grapple with the bureaucratic challenges of classifying imported human remains for taxation purposes. The medical community's response to the shortage revealed deep divisions about the fundamental value of mummy medicine that had been obscured during periods of abundant supply. Some physicians argued that the therapeutic benefits of mummy powder were so significant that any substitute was better than none, leading them to embrace increasingly dubious alternatives with characteristic medical confidence. Others began questioning whether mummy medicine had ever been effective, using the shortage as an opportunity to explore alternative treatments that didn't require international corpse trafficking. Historians still argue whether the mummy shortage accelerated the development of more rational medical practices, or simply forced physicians to find new ways to be systematically wrong about human health. But the crisis certainly marked a turning point in European pharmaceutical thinking. You find yourself in the lecture hall of Dr. William Cullen at the University of Edinburgh, listening as one of Europe's most progressive medical minds begins to articulate doubts about the therapeutic value of consuming ancient human remains. Though he's diplomatic enough to frame his skepticism in terms of dosage optimization rather than fundamental criticism of eating dead pharaohs. Year is 1770, and the early stirrings of what would eventually become evidence-based medicine are beginning to challenge centuries of medical tradition built on spectacularly questionable foundations. Dr. Cullen's students listen with rapt attention as he suggests that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be more effective treatments for respiratory ailments than grinding up Egyptian corpses, though he's careful not to completely dismiss mummy medicine, lest he be accused of radical thinking. The emergence of scientific skepticism about mummy medicine coincided with broader intellectual movements that were beginning to question traditional authority and demand empirical evidence for medical claims. The Enlightenment emphasis on rational inquiry and systematic observation was gradually penetrating medical education, leading some physicians to ask uncomfortable questions about the theoretical foundations of corpse consumption therapy. These early skeptics didn't necessarily argue that mummy medicine was completely useless. Such a position would have been professionally suicidal. But they began suggesting that other treatments might be equally effective and significantly less macabre. It was a diplomatic revolution, conducted with the careful politeness required when telling your colleagues that their favorite medical practice was essentially ritualized cannibalism. The methodological challenges of evaluating mummy medicine effectiveness highlighted the primitive state of medical research in the 18th century. How do you conduct a controlled study of ground-up pharaoh therapy when you can't control for variables like mummy age, preservation quality, or patient expectations? Early medical researchers attempted to document treatment outcomes systematically, but their studies were hampered by the lack of standardized dosages, inconsistent product quality, and the absence of control groups who weren't consuming ancient human remains. Some physicians tried comparing different grades of mummy powder to identify optimal therapeutic concentrations, inadvertently conducting the world's first clinical trials of processed corpse medicine with predictably inconclusive results. The institutional resistance to mummy medicine skepticism revealed the conservative nature of medical establishments that had invested centuries in developing elaborate theoretical frameworks to justify their practices. The Royal College of Physicians wasn't about to abandon official treatments that had been endorsed by generations of respected medical authorities, especially when those treatments were profitable for licensed practitioners and supported entire pharmaceutical supply chains. Skeptical physicians had to tread carefully, presenting their doubts as technical refinements rather than fundamental challenges to established medical wisdom. It's like trying to reform a religion by suggesting that maybe the sacred texts need better footnotes rather than questioning whether the gods exist at all. The growing availability of alternative medicines provided skeptical physicians with diplomatic opportunities to reduce their reliance on mummy powder without directly challenging its therapeutic value. New World plants like cinchona bark, containing quinine, were proving effective against specific diseases, while improved understanding of anatomy and physiology was suggesting more targeted therapeutic approaches than general corpse consumption. Some progressive physicians began prescribing mummy medicine less frequently, while emphasizing these alternative treatments, gradually weaning their practices away from ancient human remains without making dramatic public statements about the absurdity of eating pharaohs for medical purposes. The publication of critical analyses in medical journals marked a crucial turning point in professional attitudes toward mummy medicine. Though these critiques were typically framed in terms of economic efficiency rather than therapeutic effectiveness, papers appeared questioning whether the high cost of imported Egyptian corpses was justified by superior health outcomes compared to cheaper domestic remedies. Other studies examined the logistical challenges of maintaining consistent mummy quality, given the unreliable supply chains and widespread counterfeiting. These seemingly technical discussions provided cover for more fundamental skepticism about whether consuming ancient human remains made any medical sense whatsoever. Historians still argue whether these early critics genuinely believed their diplomatic criticisms, or were simply finding socially acceptable ways to call their colleagues idiots. But their influence on medical practice was undeniably significant. You sit in the pews of St. Bartholomew's Church, listening as Reverend Thomas Whitfield delivers a sermon that carefully navigates the theological minefield of condemning the consumption of human remains without directly criticizing medical practices endorsed by his wealthy parishioners who fund the church's operations. His message walks a delicate line between Christian teachings about respecting the dead and avoiding offense to congregants who have medicine cabinets full of processed pharaohs. The growing religious opposition to mummy medicine was creating uncomfortable tensions between spiritual authority and medical practice, forcing clergymen to address the awkward question of whether consuming ancient corpses violated divine commandments or merely represented questionable dietary choices. The Catholic Church's position on mummy medicine revealed the complex intersection of religious doctrine, medical authority, and practical politics in 18th century Europe. While church teachings clearly emphasized the sanctity of human remains and the importance of proper burial practices, direct condemnation of mummy medicine would have put religious authorities in conflict with medical establishments and wealthy congregants who consumed ancient Egyptian flesh for health reasons. Papal pronouncements on the subject were diplomatically vague, suggesting that consumption of human remains was inadvisable rather than explicitly sinful, though some regional bishops took stronger stands against the practice. The theological debate centered on whether ancient pagan corpses fell under the same religious protections as Christian remains, creating doctrinal loopholes that could have accommodated a small army of undead lawyers. The Protestant response to mummy medicine was equally complicated by the intersection of religious reform and medical tradition. Many Protestant denominations emphasized the importance of biblical authority over Catholic tradition, but the Bible didn't specifically address the consumption of ancient Egyptian corpses for medicinal purposes, probably because biblical authors lacked the imagination to anticipate such spectacular medical creativity. Some Protestant theologians argued that mummy medicine violated biblical principles about respecting the dead, while others maintained that God had provided all natural substances for human benefit, including conveniently preserved ancient Egyptians. The theological gymnastics required to justify eating pharaohs while maintaining Christian virtue would have impressed medieval scholastics with their capacity for creative interpretation. The emerging moral philosophy of the Enlightenment provided intellectual frameworks for criticizing mummy medicine that avoided direct confrontation with established medical or religious authority. Philosophers like David Hume and Voltaire raised questions about the ethics of desecrating human remains for commercial purposes, though they typically framed their concerns in terms of cultural sensitivity rather than medical effectiveness. The concept of universal human dignity was beginning to emerge in European intellectual circles, leading some thinkers to argue that consuming ancient Egyptians was morally problematic regardless of their therapeutic value. These philosophical objections provided intellectual respectability for opposition to mummy medicine without requiring direct challenges to medical expertise. The cultural resistance from emerging Egyptian nationalist movements added another dimension to the moral criticism of mummy medicine. As European scholars began studying ancient Egyptian civilization more systematically, some Egyptian intellectuals started objecting to the systematic desecration of their ancestors for foreign medical consumption. These early cultural preservation arguments emphasized the historical and artistic value of mummies as archaeological artifacts rather than pharmaceutical raw materials. While European authorities largely ignored these objections, they contributed to growing awareness that mummy medicine involved the destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage for dubious therapeutic benefits. The social reform movements of the late 18th century began incorporating criticism of mummy medicine into broader campaigns for moral improvement and rational social organization. Anti-slavery activists pointed out the uncomfortable parallels between treating living Africans as property and treating dead Egyptians as medical commodities. Prison reform advocates questioned the ethics of using criminal corpses as mummy substitutes when genuine Egyptian supplies ran short. These reform movements didn't focus specifically on mummy medicine, but they created intellectual and moral contexts that made the practice seem increasingly problematic to educated European audiences. The generational divide in attitudes toward mummy medicine reflected broader cultural changes occurring during the transition from traditional to modern European society. Older generations who had grown up consuming ancient corpses as routine medical practice saw nothing unusual about the therapy, while younger Europeans educated in Enlightenment principles were more likely to question the logic and morality of eating pharaohs. This generational shift created household tensions where parents continued their mummy medicine regimens, while their children refused to participate in what they increasingly viewed as barbaric family traditions. Historians still argue whether this generational change reflected genuine moral evolution or simply the eternal pattern of young people rejecting their parents' medical advice. But the demographic trends were clear enough to worry mummy medicine suppliers about their long-term market prospects. You step into the consulting room of Dr. James Lind, the progressive Scottish physician who has just published revolutionary findings about scurvy prevention using citrus fruits, representing a new approach to medicine based on systematic observation rather than ancient tradition or processed corpses. The shelves that once might have held jars of mummy powder now display bottles of various plant extracts, mineral preparations, and chemical compounds that represent the cutting edge of late 18th century pharmaceutical innovation. Dr. Lin's practice embodies the gradual shift away from exotic imported remedies toward treatments based on reproducible results and rational therapeutic principles, though he's diplomatically avoiding direct criticism of colleagues who still prescribe ground-up pharaohs for respiratory ailments. The development of more effective alternative medicines created market competition that gradually eroded demand for mummy powder without requiring direct confrontation with established medical authorities. Cinchona bark, containing natural quinine, proved remarkably effective against malaria and other fevers, providing physicians with a plant-based remedy that actually worked better than consuming ancient human remains. Digitalis, derived from foxglove plants, offered genuine therapeutic benefits for heart conditions, while ipecac provided reliable treatment for certain digestive ailments. These botanical medicines had the considerable advantage of being both more effective than mummy powder and significantly less morally problematic than eating someone's ancestors, though early adopters were careful not to emphasize the comparative aspects too aggressively. The chemical revolution, beginning to transform European science, provided new frameworks for understanding medicine that made mummy therapy seem increasingly antiquated. Pioneering chemists like Anton Lavoisier were identifying specific chemical compounds responsible for therapeutic effects, suggesting that medicines worked through measurable chemical processes rather than mysterious vital essences transferred from ancient corpses. The isolation of specific active ingredients from plant sources offered the possibility of standardized dosages and predictable therapeutic outcomes, revolutionary concepts for a medical system that had relied on the inherently variable therapeutic properties of randomly preserved pharaohs. It's like the difference between modern pharmaceuticals and whatever you might find in your grandmother's mysterious medicine cabinet, except your grandmother probably wasn't storing ancient Egyptians. The emergence of specialized medical disciplines created professional incentives for physicians to develop expertise in specific therapeutic areas, rather than relying on general-purpose remedies like mummy powder. Surgeons were achieving remarkable advances in surgical techniques, while physicians specializing in particular diseases were developing targeted treatment protocols that didn't require international corpse trafficking. The professionalization of medicine was creating career advantages for practitioners who could demonstrate expertise in scientifically defensible treatments rather than traditional remedies inherited from previous generations. Medical schools were beginning to emphasize systematic clinical observation and anatomical knowledge over memorization of ancient therapeutic formulations. The growing pharmaceutical industry was developing manufacturing processes that could produce consistent, reliable medicines without depending on the erratic supply chains required for mummy importation. Chemical companies were learning to extract and purify active compounds from plant sources, creating standardized products that offered predictable therapeutic effects. The economic advantages of domestic pharmaceutical production over imported ancient corpses were becoming increasingly apparent to business-minded apothecaries who wanted to reduce their dependence on Egyptian grave robbers for inventory management. Some entrepreneurial pharmacists began marketing their new chemical preparations as modern alternatives to traditional remedies, diplomatically avoiding direct comparisons while emphasizing the convenience and reliability of their products. The international exchange of medical knowledge was accelerating the adoption of effective treatments that made mummy medicine seem increasingly obsolete. European physicians were learning about successful therapeutic practices from other cultures, including Chinese herbal medicine, Native American botanical remedies, and Islamic medical traditions that had never embraced corpse consumption as standard practice. Medical journals were beginning to publish systematic comparisons of different treatment approaches, though these studies carefully avoided direct criticism of mummy medicine while documenting the superior effectiveness of alternative therapies. The global circulation of medical knowledge was creating professional pressures for European physicians to abandon treatments that seemed primitive compared to practices developed by cultures that had never considered eating ancient people to be reasonable medical therapy. You witness the desperate final marketing campaigns of mummy medicine suppliers as they attempt to revive a dying industry through increasingly creative promotional strategies that would make modern pharmaceutical marketers blush with embarrassment. The year is 1790, and advertisements in London newspapers promise genuine royal Egyptian mummy, certified by leading physicians, alongside testimonials from satisfied customers who claim that consuming ancient pharaohs has completely cured their chronic ailments. The promotional materials emphasize the exotic origins and royal provenance of their products, while carefully avoiding mention of the growing medical consensus that eating dead people is neither effective nor particularly appetizing. You're watching the death throes of an industry built on a foundation of spectacular medical misconception and international grave robbing. The market desperation led to increasingly aggressive sales tactics that revealed the commercial exploitation underlying mummy medicine's medical facade. Suppliers began offering bulk discounts for families planning to use mummy powder as preventive medicine throughout the coming winter, while others introduced payment plans that allowed customers to purchase ancient corpses on installment terms. Some establishments created mummy medicine clubs, where regular customers could receive priority access to premium Egyptian remains and exclusive invitations to educational seminars about optimal corpse consumption techniques. The competitive pressure was forcing suppliers to treat mummy powder like any other consumer product, complete with customer loyalty programs and seasonal promotional campaigns. The quality control standards collapsed as suppliers struggled to maintain inventory levels with increasingly unreliable sources of genuine Egyptian mummies. Products labeled as Premium Dynasty XXI Pharaoh might contain anything from processed livestock to recently deceased Europeans who had been artificially aged through chemical treatments. The counterfeiting industry reached new levels of sophistication, with entire manufacturing operations dedicated to producing fake mummies that could fool casual inspection by desperate apothecaries. Some suppliers began offering satisfaction guarantees on their mummy products, promising refunds if customers weren't completely satisfied with their ancient corpse consumption experience, probably the first and only money-back guarantee in history for eating someone's ancestors. The medical profession's growing ambivalence toward mummy medicine created professional dilemmas for physicians who had built their practices around prescribing ancient human remains. Some doctors quietly reduced their mummy prescriptions while avoiding public statements about changing their therapeutic approaches, diplomatically transitioning their patients to alternative treatments without explicitly criticizing their previous medical advice. Others doubled down on mummy medicine advocacy, arguing that the recent supply problems and quality issues didn't invalidate centuries of successful therapeutic tradition. The professional medical literature became increasingly divided between defenders of traditional corpse-based medicine and advocates for newer therapeutic approaches that didn't require eating pharaohs. The regulatory environment began shifting as government authorities started paying attention to the public health implications of widespread corpse consumption. Some jurisdictions introduced quality standards for imported human remains, requiring certification that mummy products contained actual ancient Egyptian flesh rather than domestic substitutes of questionable origin. Other regions began taxing mummy imports as luxury goods rather than medical necessities, increasing prices and reducing demand among cost-conscious consumers. The bureaucratization of corpse importation created administrative barriers that made mummy medicine less convenient for both suppliers and customers, though the regulations were typically framed in terms of trade policy rather than public health concerns. The cultural shift in public attitudes toward mummy medicine was perhaps more decisive than regulatory or professional changes in determining the industry's fate. Educated Europeans were becoming increasingly embarrassed by their ancestors' medical practices, viewing mummy consumption as a primitive tradition that reflected poorly on European civilization's claims to moral and intellectual superiority. The practice was beginning to seem not just medically questionable, but socially inappropriate, associated with superstition rather than scientific progress. Historians still argue whether this cultural transformation reflected genuine moral evolution or simply changing fashion in medical consumption. But the social stigma attached to eating ancient people was becoming too strong for even effective marketing campaigns to overcome. You find yourself in the reading room of the Royal Society of Medicine in 1850, examining historical medical texts that document the mummy medicine era with the fascinated horror of people who have finally realized that their predecessors spent centuries systematically eating ancient Egyptians to treat head colds. The leather-bound volumes contain detailed prescriptions, treatment protocols, and theoretical justifications for therapeutic practices that now seem like elaborate practical jokes played by history on human rationality. Medical students studying these historical documents struggle to understand how educated, intelligent physicians could have spent generations confidently prescribing ground-up pharaohs while maintaining their professional reputations and social standing. You're witnessing the moment when medical progress becomes sufficiently advanced to recognize its own former absurdity, though future generations will undoubtedly have similar reactions to contemporary medical practices that seem perfectly reasonable today. The intellectual legacy of mummy medicine extended far beyond its specific therapeutic applications, influencing broader patterns of medical thinking about exotic remedies and cultural superiority. The European embrace of ancient Egyptian corpse consumption reflected deeper assumptions about the therapeutic value of rare, expensive, and culturally distant substances that continued to influence pharmaceutical development long after mummy powder disappeared from apothecary shelves. The same logic that made consuming pharaohs seem medically reasonable also supported the belief that exotic plants, rare minerals, and expensive imported remedies were inherently more effective than common domestic treatments. Modern pharmaceutical marketing still exploits similar psychological biases, though contemporary exotic remedies are typically plant-based rather than human-based. The economic impact of the mummy medicine trade created lasting changes in international commerce and colonial relationships that extended far beyond its medical applications. The European demand for Egyptian corpses established trading networks and commercial relationships that facilitated other forms of cultural exploitation, including the systematic removal of archaeological artifacts and artistic treasures from Egyptian sites. The infrastructure developed for mummy trafficking, shipping networks, quality assessment procedures, and international payment systems was later adapted for other colonial trade goods. The mummy trade represented an early example of cultural commodification, where European economic demand transformed Egyptian cultural heritage into export commodities for foreign consumption. Regulatory lessons learned from mummy medicine failures influenced the development of modern pharmaceutical oversight and quality control systems. Government authorities, who had struggled with the challenges of regulating imported human remains, distinguishing genuine products from counterfeits, ensuring consistent quality standards, and protecting consumers from fraudulent suppliers, developed administrative frameworks that were later applied to conventional pharmaceutical regulation. The mummy medicine era demonstrated the need for systematic quality control in medical products, though it took several more centuries for regulatory systems to evolve sufficient sophistication to actually protect consumers from dangerous or ineffective treatments. The cultural memory of mummy medicine has been systematically sanitized in popular historical narratives, reflecting society's discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of European medical barbarism during the supposedly enlightened 18th century. Most historical accounts of the period mention mummy medicine briefly, if at all, focusing instead on more respectable medical developments like smallpox inoculation and anatomical research. Systematic consumption of ancient human remains for therapeutic purposes doesn't fit comfortably into narratives of European cultural advancement and scientific progress, leading to historical amnesia about practices that were once considered mainstream medical treatment. Historians still argue whether this selective memory reflects genuine shame about past practices or simply the natural tendency to emphasize historical developments that support contemporary cultural self-image. The philosophical implications of mummy medicine's widespread acceptance challenge comfortable assumptions about the relationship between education, intelligence, and rational decision-making. The physicians, apothecaries, and patients who enthusiastically participated in systematic corpse consumption weren't ignorant peasants or primitive tribespeople. They were educated members of European society's intellectual elite, trained in the most advanced medical schools, and affiliated with prestigious scientific institutions. Their confident embrace of therapeutic cannibalism suggests that intelligence and education provide no reliable protection against spectacular logical failures when cultural assumptions and economic incentives align to support irrational practices. The mummy medicine era offers a sobering reminder that future generations may view contemporary medical practices with similar bewilderment and horror. As you settle deeper into your chair, letting the weight of this historical absurdity wash over you like a warm, albeit slightly disturbing, blanket, remember that these weren't evil people or ignorant primitives. They were intelligent, educated individuals who became convinced that the solution to their sniffles lay in consuming 3,000-year-old Egyptian nobles. The most unsettling aspect of this entire story isn't the grotesque nature of the practice itself, but the systematic, institutional way it was normalized and legitimized by people who should have known better. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, consider how many of our own confident medical certainties might seem equally bizarre to future generations, who will study our practices with the same fascinated horror we reserve for mummy medicine. The cycle of medical progress means that today's cutting-edge treatments become tomorrow's historical curiosities, though hopefully future medical errors won't involve quite so much consumption of ancient corpses. Sweet dreams, and perhaps be grateful that your cold remedies come from pharmacies rather than pharaohs, that your medicine cabinet contains pills rather than pulverized people, and that modern healthcare, whatever its flaws, has moved beyond the systematic grinding of ancient civilizations into therapeutic powder. Rest easy knowing that human medical knowledge, despite its spectacular historical failures, continues its slow, sometimes backwards, but ultimately forward progression toward actually understanding how to heal, rather than simply how to consume our ancestors in increasingly creative ways.